Welcome everybody to Merry Musings 10. This one is focused on language, subtitled From a Language of Separation to a Language of Connection. And like in some of the previous ones, we're going to do a little bit of an evolutionary journey around the question of language and how it's evolved and how our relationship to it has evolved over time. Three of the books, and there were others, but three of the books that inspired me in this, the main one was Leonard Schleyn's book on the alphabet versus the goddess, which is really definitely worth a read. And most recently, I came across David Peat's work, who was very familiar with David Bohm. And it's a lovely book, Pathways of Chance, which contain, and he's written some really interesting things about language as well. And then of course Anne Baring's great work, The Dream of the Cosmos, where she also references language quite a lot. So three of the sources, but I also looked at some of Umberto Eco's work on language, and I read a whole book on symbols and symbolism, which I couldn't find anywhere. But that's also kind of fed into it and into my notes over the years. So as in some of the other Merry Musings, we're going to look at how language has evolved in parallel with the collective human journey over time. And the framework for that journey is the spiral dynamics model that tracks individual and collective development through phases of development, where these first two earlier phases are more the survival driven phases, hunter-gatherer, where the core perspective was more of a cyclical one, and then evolved through these four central phases where the perspective was more linear and there was more of a rational cognitive experience of reality, and then into the integral or holistic phases that I call volutionary, because that for me is the perspective that integrates all the earlier ones with these higher stages or more complex stages of development, these translinear stages. So as I was going through all of the notes and things I had on this, this insight came to me. So it's just a quote from me, not from anybody else at the top. When you immerse yourself in a language, you immerse yourself in a perspective. So the language and the structure of the language itself reflects a worldview. So it's a mirror of the way that we look at the world. And so that fits very much this way of reviewing language through these different worldviews that have evolved over time. And then I found this other quote at the bottom that I thought was really relevant. Over time, the structure of your thalamus, that's in the back of your brain, it kind of connects up two parts of your brain at the back, changes in response to your conscious words, thoughts, and feelings. And we believe that the thalamic changes affect the way in which you perceive reality. So language, brain, perception and experience of reality are interwoven. And rather than describing it maybe in such a causal way as Newberg and Waldman here do, I'd suggest more that it's a co-emergence or a co-evolution of the biology with the way of perceiving the world with language. That there's a pattern underneath them that one could use, let's say, this spiral dynamics model for, that is evolving as a pattern, and then as that pattern evolves, so our brain evolves, so our language evolves, so our perception of reality, perception of time and space, and other things that we've discussed in other Merry Musings co-arise. So it's not so much this one happened and that caused that, but they're a co-arising of a volutionary process. So we start as normal with the earlier phases of development. the pre-rational, where language is more instinctive. And this was from Harold Booner's work on plant intelligence. And he says, plants speak using auditory signals through a complex sound-based language that is far more ancient than the human, though it exists in a much subtler sound spectrum than our own. So this idea of language actually existing pre-human, in a way, in the plant world, and pre this earliest first stage here, but still communication going on, enabling communication in a spectrum where we've talked about the kind of light spectrum as being an example of the spectrum of information, where the information at the center is more dense, let's say. So that's where our also sound spectrum exists, in that kind of what we would call the gross or the more dense part of the spectrum. But there is that spectrum of information continues and is becomes more subtle, and it's using our other senses that we're able to access them. Booner suggesting that that is the part of the spectrum where the plants communicate, for example. This is Anne Baring quoting Jung, Carl Jung. Jung says, as scientific understanding has grown, so as we move from these pre-rational into the rational phases, so our world has become dehumanized. Man feels himself isolated in the cosmos because he's no longer involved in nature and has lost his emotional, unconscious identity with natural phenomena. So this refers to this split that I've talked about in Volution between these pre-rational phases of development, the beige and the purple here, and then the emergence of the sense of separate self. And the fact that when that emerged, we weren't able to wrap in and remember our intrinsic interconnectedness to reality, but we pushed it away and split ourselves off from it, which in the Pain and the Promise thesis is really what I'm suggesting is the cause of all our troubles right now. So Jung connecting it to that. So these natural phenomena have slowly lost their symbolic implications. No voices now speak to man from stones, plants, and animals, nor does he speak to them believing they can hear. His contact with nature has gone, and with it has gone the profound emotional energy that this symbolic connection supplied. So this earlier level of interconnectedness closely related to the felt senses, the emotional senses, not just the cognitive or rational. This enormous loss is compensated for by the symbols of our dreams. They bring up our original nature, its instincts and peculiar thinking. Unfortunately, however, they express their contents in the language of nature, which is strange and incomprehensible to us. It therefore confronts us with the task of translating it into the rational words and concepts of modern speech, which has liberated itself from its mystical participation with the things it describes. Key, right? That the modern language has separated itself from its participation with the things it describes. So it's not just in this earlier phase, language communication was in interaction with the world around us through a relationship, a connectedness to the world around us. And as we'll see a bit later on, now what has happened is it's through the separation, things have been objectified and labeled as if we were separate from them. So David Peat makes an interesting distinction between language which focuses on process and language which focuses on objects. And in this phase, in these earlier phases, language tended to use verbs to describe processes happening in the present. So language was all about a description of what was going on in the moment. This is Schlein. The feminine principle and Chinese writing share emphasis on synthesis, holism, simultaneity, I should say, and concreteness. In almost every aspect, ideograms are the opposite of alphabet's linear masculine mode. The Chinese written language does not contain tenses to indicate the past, present, and future. So the language has emerged from, as it were, these earlier phases, and to some extent kept features of them. Spoken Chinese has no distinct parts. Depending on the dialect, Chinese contains 400 to 800 monosyllabic sounds, or as linguists call them, vocables, none of which signifies a specific word. In fact, there is no word for the word word in Chinese, because the Chinese language has no words. Besides the holistic nature of its syntax, spoken Chinese depends heavily on musicality. Each Chinese vocable has 4 to 9 tones, and the meaning of each vocable can vary according to the sing-song manner in which it's spoken. So a completely different concept of language. We tend to assume that, letters built up to words, built up to sentences, etc., is the way language is. But here's a completely different way of communicating. Likewise, Greg Braden describes speakers of the North American Hopi language, describing the events of everyday life without using or even referencing the experience of time. In other words, the Hopi language uses words that describe the present moment and what's happening in the moment, with no words to directly describe the past or future. So that reflects the nature of this pre-rational, pre-cognitive, non-linear experience of reality that was all about an instinctive living in the present moment, where, as we discussed during the Merry Musing on time, where time is not linear but cyclical. Early Sumerian writers placed their characters not in a line, but haphazardly within the confines of a writing tablet surface. So they would just put the characters down without any order to them. And the scribes had to rely on pattern recognition, the simultaneous appreciation of all the symbols. So not linear, one letter, stroke word, stroke sentence at a time, one after the other, but a simultaneous appreciation of all of the symbols and the recognition of the pattern in them to be able to make sense of the messages. Again, a very different approach to communication, reflecting the world view and the experience of the world of that time. Okay, moving on to a world that we're more familiar with, and a lot of these comments will reflect more the, let's say, the limits of this in the context of what I've described as this split. So in itself, the emergence of these phases of development, the emergence of the sense of separate self, this emergence of the ability to focus on the differences between things in the world around us, is in itself a very valuable development. The problem comes when, instead of transcending and including the previous phases of development, we transcend and repress them. And so then you have this objectification of reality out of the context of the interconnectedness. And that's when things start to go wrong. And that's where we get a language here that is disconnecting us from reality because of this split, is my thesis. So in this phase, language uses names to fix things as objects. So once you've named it, you've defined it, it's fixed, not much more to say. Whereas in the earlier phases, we were describing process. The language was describing movement and process. Now it's a naming of something to fix it as an object. Very different. So language becomes more about things than about process. As I said before, this is what David Peat spends quite a lot of time describing in his work. Russell Targ, who some of you may know from his work on the kind of world of quantum and the world of more parapsychology and intuitive communication and things. He says the naming of things has taken us out of connection with life as we have objectified it. So there's the subject and there's the object, boom, and we're separate. In his YouTube of his TED Talk, he says how naming things has created a separation between us and the things themselves. And his call is to stop naming and describe impressions instead. So you see again, what that does is that brings us back to the present moment, because we're describing in the moment the impression that something is making on us, rather than giving it a label and parking it, as it were. And this is Anne Baring again talking about Jung. The symbolic language, and this is my interpretation of it, the symbolic language that we lost in the split, so between the pre-rational and the rational, is what we encounter in dreams and have such difficulty interpreting with our rational mind, as we're not accustomed to engaging natural phenomena in this way. So in the dream world, we are still accessing the communication and information in that natural, organic, symbolic way. But because we're not used to experiencing things in that way anymore, we find it very hard to make sense of our dreams, because we try to do so through our unrooted rational mind. Direct quote then from Anne Baring. Jung defined sickness or neurosis as a state of incompleteness and health as a state of wholeness, brought about through the reconnection of the conscious mind or ego with the unconscious, through paying attention to dreams, synchronistic events, and engaging in a dialogue with the spirit of the depths. So healing, through healing that split that I've described, the conscious mind or the ego is what emerges with this red value system, the third one up, the individuation process. But we split off from that more instinctive, which became the unconscious. And so he's Jung's key thing is the importance of healing, again, that relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, healing that split. Shlein, the original Hebrew word for spirit, ruah, which means breath, is a feminine noun. When it was translated from Hebrew to Greek and into this more rational language framing, she lost her femininity. Spiritus, the Latin translation of the Greek word, is a masculine noun. So where the pre-rational had its foundations in the feminine, and as we come into this rational phase, these four central phases, the focus is more on the masculine, and we'll go into more depth on Schlein's perspective on that in a bit. He says the induction of any member of society, usually a young child, into alphabet arcana numbs her to the fact that she supplants all at once Gestalt perception, pattern recognition, with a new, a natural, highly abstract one at a time cognition, with a new, natural, highly abstract, one at a time cognition. So not all at once, but one at a time. One letter, one word at a time, one sentence at a time. In this fashion, alphabet subliminally elevated within each alphabet user the influence of the left hemisphere of the brain at the expense of the right. So again, the right brain was more active in the earlier phases, in the pre-rational, and then the left brain becomes dominant in the rational. So yeah, Schleyn's big thesis in his Alphabet versus the Goddess book is that essentially it was the emergence of our alphabetic language that caused the split with the feminine and with the goddess. Now, you can certainly see the parallels, but as I said at the beginning, my sense is not so much that one caused the other, but that it was a co-emergence, that these things happened together, driven by underlying patterns and dynamics. So the split, as the split happened, so our alphabetic language emerged because it was the best fit with the kind of underlying pattern that was emerging, this one of disconnection that happened after the split. So Schleyn, this was his right at the beginning, how he describes the impulse behind his book. I was struck by the thought that the demise of the goddess, the plunge in women's status, and the advent of harsh patriarchy and misogyny occurred around the time that people were learning how to read and write. Perhaps there was something in the way people acquired this new skill that changed the brain's actual structure. Again, I'd say that happened in parallel. I hypothesize that when a critical mass of people within a society acquire literacy, especially alphabetic literacy, left hemispheric modes of thought are reinforced at the expense of right hemispheric ones, which manifest as a decline in the status of images, women's rights, and goddess worship. But basically, the whole of his book is making that case pretty convincingly. And the only thing, as I say, I would take issue with is the, ironically enough, the linear causality that he suggests between language and that. I'd say it's more of a co-emergence. He says the left brain is the seat of logical thought processes. That one thing follows another forms the basis of linear cause and effect thinking. The practice of alphabetic reading and writing over long periods will subliminally reinforce the user's belief that the world is a chain-linked tessellation of events that occur in the linear time. So again, this relationship between, we have language that has this kind of one at a time linear process. We're coming together with an experience of events in the world around us as being linear in time. All Western alphabet religions believe that God has a perspectivist point of view, looking down on his creation from on high. So again, a separation of the divine from the earth, from the material, set outside of the world looking down. People in non-alphabetic traditions believe that the deity is both of and in the world. So a panentheistic worldview, that the divine is in everything around us. The deity isn't on the cloud, she is the cloud. So the whole religious perspectives and the experience of the divine that evolves together with the different language as well, and how you can see the pattern between the kind of language and the kind of worldview. East and West, and so he links it now to the kind of geopolitics, as it were. East and West have manifested significant differences. The left brain alphabet cultures have been more aggressive in war, conquest, and exploration. The writers of the ideographic characters built a wall around the country to keep foreigners out and discouraged exploration. Alphabet cultures, due to their extremely dualistic form of writing, are more inclined to impose their systems of belief on others, and therefore religious persecution is commonplace, whereas religious tolerance has been the way of the Gestalt-based ideographic cultures. So although originally my belief is that these co-emerge as worldviews, I say, influencing language, our view on time, our how we relate to the other. Of course, once it's established and children are born into a reality, then the immediate exposure to language of this kind, gets the brain into the right space, as it were, for the worldview and the kind of culture they're moving into. So it then becomes very hard to shift something when it's so embedded everywhere in all aspects of the culture. Yeah, so David Bohm, paper of Pete and Ford, saying that a defect of our common language is that it enfolds a mechanistic view of the world. So literally the world view embedded, reflected in the language. Where it's seen, where language is seen as this neutral vehicle for the transportation of meaning. So again, it's a very linear perspective, because the purpose then of language is seen as getting an idea from one place to another place. Transportation, it's just a vehicle for transportation of meaning. Niels Bohr, the unambiguous interpretation of any measurement must be essentially framed in terms of the classical physical theories. And we may say that in this sense, the language of Newton and Maxwell will remain the language of physicists for all time. So in the world of physics, Bohr saying any time you interpret a measurement unambiguously, so in a fixed way, as opposed to with uncertainty as part of it, the moment that it's fixed and language is used to describe it in that way, that is what you see in the classical physical theories. And so the language of physicists is going to remain that way, Bohr was saying, as long as they keep interpreting measurements in this unambiguous, fixed way. So David Bohm again. David Bohm pointed to the subject-predicate nature of languages, subject-object. We have a subject and an object linked by a verb. The cat chases the mouse. We begin with two objects, each have independently existing properties, and then link them together via some sort of action, the verb. This is analogous to what happens in the world of classical physics, where independent objects interact by forces. So that's the kind of classical rational world. But he says what they're finding in the quantum world is that it's holistic, and its essence is not built out of independent elements like some jigsaw puzzle. Rather, all is process and movement. In fact, Bohm referred to this as the hollow movement, the movement of the whole. So as we see the world of quantum physics emerge, we're seeing that our current form of language is inadequate to reflect the reality that we're discovering in the quantum world, because our current language is this one at a time linear process, whereas the quantum world, it's all interconnected, the movement of the whole. So we get back in a way to this kind of pre-rational experience of things all at once at the same time. So what does it look like then if we reintegrate these two? So there's not a separation and not a split, and we go translinear. How have people attempted to describe language beyond this rational, linear objectification language? Here's Schlein. Queen Nancia of Wei once asked Confucius what he would do if placed in charge. Confucius replied, "First, I would rectify names." By his succinct answer, Confucius identified the corruption of language as the single most pressing problem bedeviling society. Lao Tzu, remember, stated in the opening lines of his work that the first priority of society should be to ignore names. Naming is the principal prerogative of the left brain. Ranks, titles, and patronymics are common to all patriarchal cultures. So this, again, this idea of the name, the noun, being the label of the thing that fixes it as a thing rather than as a process, and that then being linked to how our societies are organized with ranks and titles, all separate things put then in hierarchies that so inform the way we organize ourselves as humanity at the moment. Get rid of it, says Confucius and Lao Tzu. The left brain rebels against the Tao. How it demands is one to understand the Tao if one can't read about it, argue about it, speak about it, or even think about it. Lao Tzu recommended relying on intuition, that most ineffable feminine principle of the right brain. Language is destiny, says Schlein. Which one a child learns to speak will determine how he or she thinks. The unity and continuity of Chinese script symbolizes the character of China's civilization, just as the rise and fall of Western civilizations reflect the constant flux of alphabetic written languages. Like yin and yang, these two cultures are both opposite and complementary. Like the hemispheres of the brain, each has the missing input and outlook the other needs to achieve wholeness. So we're looking for the integration of the two, the integration of alphabetic and ideographic, West and East, and left and right brain awaits the next stage in human evolution. So Schlein really reinforcing what we're looking at here in terms of these two earlier phases of development. And the point being that we now need to integrate them to be able to make the best of both, and in particularly to be able to earth and ground and give context to the rational mind that has unrooted itself and created all this experience of disconnection as it split from the pre-rational kind of hunter-gatherer reality. Is it not possible for the syntax and grammatical form of language? I think this was Bohm or Pete. I haven't got the label there, but the name, Bohm or Pete. Is it not possible for the syntax and grammatical form of language to be changed so as to give a basic role to the verb rather than to the noun? So if we're focused on process, can we put the verb at the center? This would help us to end the sort of fragmentation indicated above, for the verb describes actions and movements which flow into each other and merge without sharp separations or breaks. Moreover, since movements are in general always changing, they have in them no permanent pattern of fixed form with which separately existent things could be identified. So this was Bohm, maybe quoted by Pete, that was trying to work out, okay, if we take this principle that language needs to be focused on process and movement rather than fixing things as objects, then how do we do it? And his suggestion was, well, what would happen if we made the verb central? Oh yeah, here we go. David Bohm, Wholeness in the Implicate Order. Bohm takes, for example, the Latin noun for truth, verus, and transforms it into its verbal form, to verate. He defines this so: to verate is to be in the act of perceiving truth, as well as to be attending to what truth means. So rather than talking about something being true, he would talk about one verating something. So in the act of perceiving in the moment the truth of something. That kind of fundamentally changes your relationship to reality. So if we bring them together, and we look to integrate these. This is kind of Schlein towards the end of his book. The benefits of alphabet literacy are magnificent and life-changing. Even when we become aware that literacy has a downside, in my thesis, because of the separation, the split, no reasonable person would throw the baby out with the bathwater and recommend that people should not become literate. Instead, we seek a renewed respect for iconic information, which in conjunction with the ability to read can bring our two hemispheres into greater equilibrium and allow both individuals and cultures to become more balanced. Now, my kind of question is that when you do that, it's not just going to be 1 + 1 = 2, that something will emerge out of that integration that transcends yet includes the previous ones, but has emergent elements to it that are not just combining the pre-rational sensing with the rational objectification, but that actually gives us some other form of language that would reflect the form of consciousness that emerges at that point, but we can't predict by just trying to add the two together. So I could take it a little bit further than Schlein here and say that it's not just putting them together, but it's in that integration process, looking at what the emergent properties are then of language that emerges in that new space of consciousness. Ford and Pete in a paper ask, do we speak and have language because we think? So did thought create language, or do we think because we speak? So did language create thought? And they suggest that the rational objective mindset believes the former, i.e. believes that we speak because we think, whereas Pete, and referencing Bohm, says, no, we think because we speak. And I think it's the wrong question, as hopefully you've picked up by now, which is that it's not either or, but that these are phenomena that co-arise out of a certain field of consciousness, a certain pattern underlying it, that gives us kind of rational thought and this kind of form of linear language. So that's it for today's journey. And as you'll see from what I've been able to find, there is very little definition or attempt to even describe in a more detailed way what that language might be at that new level, if it indeed does have emergent properties beyond just adding the pre-rational sensing and the rational kind of linear naming and objectification. But there is very little I could find around that. So that's an interest, it can be an interesting topic for our inquiry.